You've been told the story wrong. The Huns swept out of the east. Attila, the scourge of God, rode for the gates of Rome, and the greatest city on earth fell before the horse lords. It's a great story. There's just one problem. Attila never took the city of Rome. He never even tried to hold it. And yet, by the time he was finished, the Western Roman Empire was a hollow shell counting down to its own funeral. So here's the question that should bother you for the next 10 minutes. How do you destroy an empire without ever conquering its capital? Because Attila figured it out, and the most disturbing part isn't how he did it. It's who handed him the keys. Let's get the map right first, because almost everyone pictures this wrong. When you imagine Rome in the 5th century, you're probably picturing the city, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Seven Hills. But by Attila's lifetime, the city of Rome wasn't even the capital anymore. The emperors ruled from Ravenna, a fortress town tucked behind marshes in the north. Rome was a symbol, a trophy, the real empire. The thing that actually kept the lights on wasn't a city at all. It was the provinces, the grain fields of North Africa, the tax rolls of the Balkans, the gold that flowed in from 100 territories and paid the soldiers who held the whole thing together. And that's the insight Attila had that no one gives him credit for. He understood that you don't kill an empire by stabbing it in the heart. You kill it by bleeding it from everywhere else. So he did exactly that. Start with the East, with Constantinople, and the Emperor Theodosius II. Attila didn't march his cavalry at those famous triple walls. He knew horse archers couldn't crack them. Instead, he burned everything around them. In the 400s and 40s, he took city after city along the Danube, Naissus, Serdica, the towns that fed the region, and he ground the Eastern Roman field army into the dirt in a string of battles. And then, having proven he could take everything except the walls, he sat down and named his price. In the peace deal that followed, the Romans agreed to hand over 6,000 pounds of gold up front. Then he tripled their yearly tribute to 2,100 pounds of gold, every single year, forever. Picture that. Not a battle, not a siege, a subscription. The most powerful empire in the world paying a protection racket in gold by the ton to a man who never once broke down its front door. And here's where it gets worse. Because that gold wasn't sitting in a vault doing nothing. That was the money that paid soldiers, that built walls, that fed cities. Every pound of it that went north into Attila's saddlebags was a pound that couldn't defend the empire against the next threat. And in the 5th century, there was always a next threat. The Vandals were eating North Africa, which happened to be where a huge share of Rome's food came from. The Visigoths were carving up Spain and southern France. Rome had already lost its richest gold mines in Spain to invaders decades earlier. So this is an empire that's losing its income and its farmland at the exact moment a warlord is charging it a fortune to be left alone. You don't need to sack the capital when you've turned the entire treasury into a faucet pointed at your own tent. Now, if the story ended there, it'd already be a brilliant, brutal piece of strategy. But it doesn't end there, because I told you the most disturbing part wasn't how Attila did it. It was who handed him the keys. And to understand that, you have to understand something Rome had been doing for years before Attila was ever a threat. They'd been inviting the Huns in. On purpose. Meet Flavius Aetius. If you've never heard his name, that's about to feel like a crime, because this one man is the hinge the entire story turns on. Aetius was a Roman general, one of the most capable the West produced in its final century, and as a boy he'd been handed over to the Huns as a hostage, a common way of sealing deals between Rome and its neighbors. So Aetius grew up among them. He spoke their language. He knew their leaders personally. He understood better than any Roman alive exactly how terrifying a Hun cavalry charge could be. And he realized something that would poison the next 30 years of Roman history. He realized he could rent it. So watch what he does with that. In the year 425, the Western throne is up for grabs. A usurper named Joannes has seized power, and Aetius is his man. When the Eastern Empire sends an army to crush Joannes, Aetius doesn't panic. He rides north to his old friends, and he comes back leading a Hunnic army, 60,000 men by the ancient count, into the heart of Roman Italy. 60,000 Huns brought across the border not by an invading enemy, but by a Roman general, to settle a Roman argument about who gets to wear the purple. He arrived 3 days too late to save Joannes, who'd already been executed. But it didn't matter. He had 60,000 reasons for the Roman court to negotiate. And negotiate they did. They paid the Huns to go home, and they made Aetius commander of the armies in Gaul. That's the deal. That's how it worked. You could lose a war for the throne and still win, as long as you showed up with enough Huns at your back. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it wasn't a one-time desperation move. It became the playbook. A few years later, Aetius gets into a power struggle with a rival Roman general named Bonifacius. He loses. He's beaten in battle, stripped of his position, run out of Italy. So what does he do? He goes back to the Huns. Again, and in the year 434 he returns with their backing and forces his way back into power, reinstated as the supreme commander of the West. Twice now, the most important military office in the Western Roman Empire has been decided not by Romans, but by Hunnic cavalry that a Roman personally invited across the border. Rome wasn't being besieged by the Huns. Rome was hiring them. Rome was training them, paying them, and teaching them exactly how much the empire was worth, and exactly how easily it could be pushed. Let that sink in for a second, because it reframes everything you thought this story was about. We imagine the fall of Rome as a wall of barbarians crashing in from outside against a Rome that fought to keep them out. But the Huns didn't have to break in. They were escorted in by the very men sworn to defend the place, who cared more about beating each other than about what they were unleashing. Every time a Roman general used Hun muscle to win a domestic squabble, he was handing Attila's people gold, military intelligence, and a first-hand tour of just how rotten the empire had become on the inside. Rome was sharpening the blade that would be held to its own throat and calling it a clever alliance. So when Attila finally does turn his full fury west in 451 and 452, understand what he's walking into. This isn't a stranger probing an unknown enemy. This is a man whose people have been inside the Roman machine for a generation. He knows the roads. He knows the weaknesses. He knows precisely how much the Romans will pay to make pain stop, because they've been paying his family for years. And he even has a pretext gift wrapped for him, because the rot wasn't only in the army, it was in the palace. In the spring of the year 450, a Roman princess named Honoria, the sister of the Western emperor himself, is being forced into a marriage she despises. So she does something extraordinary. She smuggles a message out of the palace, and with it, her ring, and she sends both to Attila the Hun. Historians still argue whether she meant it as a genuine marriage proposal or just a desperate cry for rescue, but it doesn't matter what she meant. It matters what Attila decided it meant. He announced that the emperor's own sister had agreed to marry him, and that as her dowry, he was owed half of the Western Roman Empire. Think about the sheer audacity of that, and think about why he could get away with it. A princess inside the palace, reaching out to the empire's deadliest enemy to solve a personal problem. A general outside the walls, renting that same enemy to solve his career problems. From the throne room to the battlefield, Rome kept reaching for the Huns to fix its own internal messes. And every time it did, it made Attila stronger, richer, and more convinced that the empire was his for the taking. And here's the quiet, devastating irony that ties the whole thing together. The one man who finally stopped Attila, who cobbled together a desperate alliance of Romans and Goths and met the Huns in open battle at the Catalonian plains in 451 and turned him back, was Aetius. The same Aetius who'd spent his youth among the Huns. The same Aetius who'd twice invited their armies into Italy to win his own power struggles. The man who had done more than anyone alive to bring the Huns into the Roman world was, in the end, the only one who understood them well enough to hold them off. He'd spent decades feeding the fire, and then he was the only one who knew how to fight it. So let's go back to the question I asked you at the start. How do you destroy an empire without ever conquering its capital? Now you know the answer, and it's got nothing to do with a cavalry charge at the gates of Rome. You do it by bleeding the provinces until the treasury runs dry. You do it by turning a superpower into a subscriber, paying gold by the ton to be left alone. And most of all, you do it by waiting, patiently. While that empire's own leaders, too busy fighting each other to notice, walk your armies through the front door again and again, and teach you every weakness they have. Attila didn't need to destroy Rome. He just needed Rome to keep hiring him. The scourge of God didn't break down the wall. He was invited in, and handed the keys by the very people who should have been guarding them. The empire wasn't murdered by a stranger in the night. It was bled dry by a weapon it had bought, sharpened, and welcomed home.